The wind in Redemption Springs had teeth. It was a mean, biting wind that came down from the mountains in the winter of 1887 with no regard for worn-out wool or the small gaps in a little girl's mittens. It scoured the main street, a straight, defiant line of wood and mud, and drove the townsfolk behind their glass windows, leaving the world to Sarah Mitchell and her daughter. Sarah pulled the thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, her body a shield against the relentless cold for 5-year-old Emma, whose small hand was tucked firmly in hers. Every step they took on the frozen planks of the boardwalk felt like a judgment. She saw it in the flicker of a curtain in the tailor's window, in the way Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, paused her sweeping to stare. They were a spectacle, a woman and a child with no man to their name, a story the town had written for them without ever asking for a single word of truth. Her goal was simple, as stark and bare as the winter landscape. Keep Emma safe. Keep a roof, any roof, over their heads, and hold on to the last frayed threads of her dignity. For Emma, the world was less complicated. Her mother was the fixed point in her universe, the one who could mend a torn dress, soothe a scraped knee, and make a supper out of almost nothing. She trusted her mother's strength, unaware of how brittle it had become. 4 coins. That was all that stood between them and a hollow hunger tonight. 4 bits of metal Sarah had earned by mending the fishing nets of a freighter down by the river, her fingers stiff and clumsy in the cold. She clutched them in her pocket, their weight a small, cold comfort. The bell above the door of the General Mercantile jangled a cheerless tune as she pushed it open. The air inside was thick with the scent of coffee beans, cured meat, and self-righteousness. Mrs. Gable stood behind the counter, a woman built like a barrel, her arms crossed over her apron. Her husband was nowhere to be seen, but his wife was the true guardian of the town's morality. "We need flour," Sarah said, her voice quiet but clear. "And a bit of salt pork?" Mrs. Gable's eyes, small and hard as pebbles, flickered from Sarah to Emma and back again. A slow, thin smile stretched her lips. "We do not serve your kind here." The words were spoken calmly, a statement of fact, as if she were merely announcing they were out of molasses. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face, the warmth of the store suddenly turning suffocating. She could feel Emma press closer to her leg. "I have money," Sarah insisted, pulling the 4 coins from her pocket and placing them on the worn wooden counter. They made a small, lonely, clinking sound. "Your money is not the issue, Mrs. Gable said, her gaze fixed on a point just over Sarah's shoulder. "It is a matter of propriety. Reverend Hutchkins has made it clear. This is a decent town. We cannot encourage loose morals by offering charity to the fallen." Fallen! The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Sarah looked at the sacks of flour, the slabs of bacon, the barrels of pickles, food, life, all of it denied by a woman's tight lips and a preacher's decree. She wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice, but one look at Emma's wide, questioning eyes silenced her. She would not let her daughter see her break. Not here. With a deliberate slowness she did not feel, she picked up her 4 coins, one by one, and closed her fist around them. "I was not asking for charity," she said, her voice a low murmur. "I was asking to buy food for my child." She turned, her back straight, and walked out of the store, the jangle of the bell sounding like a jeer behind them. The wind hit them again, harder this time. The cold was no longer just in the air, it was inside her, a deep, gnawing chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Emma stumbled beside her, her small face pinched with confusion and cold. "Mama, why did the lady say no?" "She was having a bad day. Sweet pea," Sarah lied, the words tasting like ash. They walked toward the edge of town, toward the miserable lean-to they called home, a place that offered little more than a place to lie down out of the wind. There was nothing there, no food, no fire, just the 2 of them. It happened in an instant. A patch of ice, slick and dark on the wooden planks, lay hidden beneath a skiff of new snow. Emma's small boot slid out from under her, and she went down with a surprised cry, her body thudding hard against the boardwalk. Before Sarah could even gasp, a shadow detached itself from the alley between the saloon and the smithy. A man. He was tall and lean, dressed in the worn clothes of a man who spent more time in the saddle than on a town street. His face was weathered by sun and wind, a landscape of hard miles, but his movements were surprisingly gentle as he knelt beside Emma. "Easy there, little one," he said, his voice a low rumble, like rocks shifting deep underground. He reached out a hand, not to hoist her up, but to steady her, his calloused fingers wrapping carefully around her small arm. "You take a breath now. Let us see if anything is broken before you try to stand." Sarah froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Men in this town, in any town, were a source of trouble, of whispers and sidelong glances. But this man's eyes were not filled with judgment or pity. They were a clear, steady gray, and they were looking at Emma with a quiet concern that felt achingly foreign. He helped Emma to her feet, his hands checking her legs and arms with unpracticed ease. Anything hurt bad? Emma, more startled than injured, shook her head, her lower lip trembling. "My bottom is cold." A faint ghost of a smile touched the man's lips. "Well, the ground has a way of doing that in winter." He looked up at Sarah then, and his gaze took in her thin shawl, Emma's red nose, the raw desperation she knew must be written all over her face. He had seen them come out of the general store. He had seen it all. "My name is Jacob Brennan," he said, his voice soft. "I have a fire going, just yonder, past the livery. It is not much, but it is warm. You and the little one look like you could use some of that." Sarah's first instinct was to refuse. Pride was a bitter meal, but it was all she had left. To accept help from a stranger felt like admitting defeat, like confirming every ugly thing Mrs. Gable and Reverend Hutchkins believed about her. She was a mother alone. She could not afford to trust. But then Emma shivered, a violent, full body tremor, and the fight went out of Sarah. Her pride would not keep her daughter warm. Her pride would not fill her daughter's belly. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling rusty in her throat. Jacob Brennan simply nodded, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and led the way. His camp was small and tidy, a bedroll laid out near a crackling fire, a coffee pot sitting on a grate over the flames. It was the camp of a man who was not planning to stay, a temporary pause in a long journey. The fire, though, was a beacon. It threw dancing light against the growing twilight and pushed back the encroaching cold with a circle of radiant heat. Sarah guided Emma closer, holding her daughter's hands out to the flames until the frightening blue tinge receded from her fingertips. Jacob moved around the fire without fuss, pouring 2 cups of coffee and handing one to Sarah. He did not have a third cup, but he found a tin plate and poured a small amount of the hot liquid into it, adding a generous spoonful of sugar. "Let it cool a bit," he told Emma. "It will warm you from the inside out." They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the mournful whistle of the wind through the sparse trees. Jacob did not ask questions. He did not ask her name or why she was out in the cold with a child and no provisions. He seemed to accept their presence as he accepted the weather, a fact of the world that required no explanation. It was a kind of courtesy Sarah had not experienced in a very long time, and it unsettled her more than open hostility. Finally, she spoke, because the silence felt heavier than words. "I am Sarah. This is Emma." He nodded. "Jacob." That was all. He fed another piece of wood into the fire, the muscles in his forearms tightening under his worn shirt. His hands were rough, scarred, and capable. They were hands that knew work, that could fix what was broken. And yet they had been so gentle with her daughter. As darkness fell completely, the false warmth of the fire only served to highlight the true, deep cold of the night that lay ahead. Their lean-to would be an icebox, and there was still no food. Sarah's carefully constructed composure began to crumble. the fear she had held at bay all day rising like a tide. Jacob seemed to sense the shift in her. He stared into the flames, his expression thoughtful. "I passed a place on my way in," he said, his voice low. "Old man Patterson's cabin sits a few miles north of here, tucked back in the pines. He passed on a couple years back. I hear the place has been empty ever since." He looked at her, his gray eyes direct. "It is not much. The windows are probably broken and the roof might leak, but it has 4 walls and a stone fireplace. Good bones, if you can stand the loneliness." The offer hung in the air between them. It was not an offer of a home, not even an offer of help. It was just a piece of information, a map to a place that might be a shelter or might be a tomb. He was giving her a choice that was not really a choice at all. It was the wilderness or the town, a lonely cabin or a community that wished she would simply disappear. Sarah looked down at Emma, who had fallen asleep, her head pillowed on Sarah's lap, her face rosy in the firelight. For her, Sarah had endured the whispers, the scorn, the hunger. For her, she had swallowed her pride and followed a stranger to his fire. Now, she had to decide what came next. Could she take her child into the desolate woods? Relying on the word of a man she had just met, could she build a life from the good bones of an abandoned cabin? She looked from her sleeping daughter to the quiet stranger across the fire, a man who offered warmth without expectation. The town of Redemption Springs was behind her, a place of cold stares and closed doors. Ahead of her lay an unknown wilderness and a sliver of kindness. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff in the dark, with no way of knowing if the next step would be onto solid ground or into empty air. She thought, "Am I brave enough to step off the edge of this world for her?" The decision, once made, settled in Sarah's bones not with relief, but with the cold, heavy weight of necessity, before the first hint of gray light touched the frost on the windows of Redemption Springs. Jacob had returned. He did not come with words of reassurance, but with a sway-backed mule borrowed from the liveryman, a man whose pity was apparently greater than his allegiance to the town's moral code. The mule, whose name was Patience, seemed to understand the gravity of their exodus, standing stoically as Jacob secured their meager belongings, a single worn satchel, into a bundle behind the saddle. He lifted Emma as if she weighed nothing more than a whisper, placing her securely in the saddle's seat. He wrapped a thick, coarse blanket around her small frame until only her wide, curious eyes were visible. "Hold on tight, little one," he said, his voice a low murmur against the wind. The journey began in silence. Jacob took the mule's lead rope, his long strides eating up the frozen ground. Sarah walked beside him, her boots crunching a rhythmic, desolate beat against the snow-dusted trail. The cold was a physical presence, a thief that stole the breath from her lungs and leached the warmth from her blood. Her teeth chattered, a frantic, uncontrollable percussion. But she locked her jaw and pushed forward. Each step was an act of will, a refusal to surrender to the cold, to the town, to the despair that nipped at her heels like a hungry wolf. They were a strange, silent procession moving away from a world that did not want them, toward a world that might not exist. The trail wound its way out of the sparse plains and into the foothills, where ponderosa pines stood like silent, snow-robed sentinels. The air grew thinner, sharper. Emma, lulled by the gentle rocking of the mule, had grown quiet, her gaze fixed on the endless white landscape. "Does the snow smell like milk yet?" she asked suddenly, her small voice muffled by the blanket. The question, so innocent and strange, broke the spell of their grim march. Sarah looked at Jacob and saw the corner of his mouth twitch. "Not yet, little one," he answered, his eyes on the trail ahead. "It smells more like cold stone right now. You will know when it smells like milk. That means it is the heavy, wet kind, the kind that is good for making snowmen." Sarah watched the exchange, a small, fragile warmth unfurling in her chest. He spoke to her daughter with a gentleness that was at odds with his rough appearance. He did not talk down to her. He simply answered her peculiar question with a peculiar seriousness of his own. They walked on, the silence returning. But it felt different now, less heavy. It was a shared quiet, not an empty one. As the morning wore on, Sarah felt a desperate need to fill it, to understand the man who was leading them into the wilderness. "You are not from around here," she stated, the words coming out as a puff of white vapor. He shook his head, his gaze unwavering from the path. "No, I just drift." "What makes a man drift?" she asked, bolder than she felt. He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. The only sounds were their footsteps and the sighing of the wind through the pines. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, scraped raw with a pain that was old but not healed. "I was chasing a dream once," he began, his words measured, each one seeming to cost him something, in a town not so different from this one. "There was gold in the hills. They said a man could make his fortune overnight." He paused, his jaw tightening. "My wife, Martha, she did not want to go. We had a son, Thomas, just a baby. She wanted to stay put, build a life where we were, but I was full of fire and foolishness. I promised her a mansion. I promised her the world." He kicked at a loose stone on the path. "I went ahead to stake a claim. I was gone 3 months. By the time I got back, the cholera had come and gone. It swept through that town like a fire. They were both gone." The story fell into the frozen air and lay there between them, a thing of terrible weight, a wife and a son, lost not to a bullet or a wild animal, but to a sickness that came on the wind while he was away chasing a promise. Sarah's own loss felt small and selfish in comparison. She had lost a home, a reputation. He had lost his whole world. "I am sorry," she whispered, the words utterly inadequate. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, as if to ward off her pity. "It was my fault. I was not there. A man is supposed to be there." They walked on, the weight of his confession settling around them. Sarah thought of the life that had been stolen from her, the way the town had methodically stripped her of her standing, her friends, her ability to provide for her child. "They took everything from me," she said, the words torn from a place deep inside, "everything but my name. And then they tried to take that, too." Jacob stopped, turning to look at her fully for the first time since they left his camp. His gray eyes held a flicker of something she could not name, a shared understanding that went beyond words. "The little one calls you Mama," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "That is the most important name there is." He turned and continued walking, but something had shifted. A crack had appeared in the wall of his solitude, and a crack had appeared in hers. They were two broken people, walking a broken trail, but for a moment, they were not entirely alone. It was deep night when they finally arrived. The moon was a sliver of ice in a black sky, and the stars were hard, diamond points of light. The cabin was a dark shape against the snow, more a shadow than a structure. It sagged to one side, its porch roof tilting at a drunken angle, but the log walls looked thick and sturdy. It had, as Jacob had promised, good bones. He pushed open the heavy plank door, which groaned in protest. The air inside was colder than the air outside, still and dead, thick with the smell of dust, decay, and forgotten things. But it was a shelter. It was 4 walls. While Sarah stood uncertainly in the doorway, her arms wrapped around a now sleeping Emma, Jacob moved with a quiet efficiency. He found a stack of dry wood left by some long-ago traveler and laid a fire in the great stone hearth. He struck a match, and the small flame blossomed, pushing back the oppressive darkness and the biting cold. The fire caught, crackling to life, its orange light dancing across the room, revealing a space that was both desolate and full of potential. There was a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a built-in bed frame in one corner. Jacob brought in their satchel and his own saddlebag. He placed them on the table, his movements economical and precise. He had done what he promised. He had led them to shelter. He had built them a fire. His obligation was fulfilled. Sarah felt a surge of her old, stubborn pride. She would not be a burden. She would not be a charity case. She shifted Emma in her arms, her voice tight. "Thank you, Mr. Brennan. You have done more than enough. You should go now, before the storm sets in." The wind chose that moment to howl, rattling the single glass pane that remained in the window frame. Snow began to hiss against the wood, a whispering threat from the world outside. Jacob did not look at her. He was staring at the fire, his profile etched by the flickering light. He wore a silver locket on a leather cord around his neck, something Sarah had not noticed before. It glinted in the firelight, a small, secret thing against the rough fabric of his shirt. Emma stirred in Sarah's arms, her eyes fluttering open. She looked around the strange, firelit room, her gaze settling on Jacob. "Mama," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. "Where is Jacob's room?" The question, so simple and direct, hung in the air, dismantling all of Sarah's carefully constructed defenses. In her daughter's eyes, Jacob was not a stranger who had helped them. He was part of this. He belonged here, in this cabin, with them. It was a choice Sarah had been trying to avoid, a reality she had refused to acknowledge, and her 5-year-old daughter had laid it bare with 4 simple words. Sarah looked at Jacob, her throat too tight to speak. She saw him glance from the howling darkness outside to the small child in her arms. She saw the flicker of some deep, unreadable emotion in his eyes. He did not say a word. He did not say he would stay. He did not say he would go. Instead, he walked over to the wall near the fireplace. A single, large iron nail had been hammered into one of the logs, probably by Old Man Patterson to hang his coat. With a slow, deliberate movement, Jacob took his saddlebag from the table and hung its strap over the nail. The leather creaked in the quiet room. It was a small sound, a simple action, but it was an answer. It was a promise. The bag hung there, a dark, solid shape against the rough wood. An anchor dropped in a wild and uncertain sea. He was not leaving. He was staying, and as the snowstorm raged outside, Sarah knew, with a certainty that both terrified and calmed her, that survival had just become more important than pride. The first 3 weeks in the cabin were a conversation conducted not in words, but in work. A rhythm established itself, born of necessity and the shared, unspoken goal of survival. Each day began before sunrise, the world still a palette of blue and gray. Jacob would already be outside, his silhouette a dark, solid shape against the pale snow as he worked on the roof. The sound of his hammer was the first thing Sarah heard each morning, a steady, reassuring beat that said, "We are safe. We are building." He worked with a relentless focus, replacing rotted shakes with fresh ones he split from a fallen pine. His movements economical and sure. He was mending their shelter, making it whole. Sarah's work began inside, stoking the embers in the hearth back to life, the scent of wood smoke a primal comfort against the morning chill. After a breakfast of oatmeal, bought with the few dollars Jacob had in his saddlebag, their days would diverge into a pattern so natural it felt as though they had been living it for years. While Jacob was on the roof or reinforcing the chinking between the logs, Sarah would take on the cabin's interior. She scrubbed the floors with sand and water until the wood shone, patched the holes in the walls with a mixture of mud and dried grass, and stretched a piece of oiled parchment over the broken window, casting a warm, golden light into the small space. She strung a clothesline between 2 pines, the bright white of a washed shirt against the dark green of the trees, a small, defiant flag of domesticity. Emma became the small, bright spark that moved between them. She had discovered a trio of scrawny chickens left behind in a half-collapsed coop, survivors as stubborn as they were. The birds became her sole responsibility, and she took to it with a fierce seriousness, chasing them through the snow, her laughter echoing in the still, cold air. She named them with the simple logic of a child who understood the fundamentals of life. The white one was flour, the brown one was water, and the speckled one, who was always getting into trouble, was salt. Together, she would tell them, they could make bread. They ate meals of rabbit stew, the meat from Jacob's snares, and heavy, dark bread Sarah baked in a cast-iron pot nestled in the coals of the fire. These were not the hurried, desperate meals of the road. They were the kind of food that took time, that required a hearth and a home. The kind of food you cooked only when you believed you would be there tomorrow to eat the leftovers. In the small, quiet moments, a different kind of building was taking place. One evening, by the flickering firelight, Sarah was mending a tear in the shoulder of Jacob's shirt. The wool was coarse beneath her fingers, worn thin from years of sun and wind. Her stitches were small and neat, a line of order against the garment's frayed history. Without thinking, her needle began to move in a different pattern. When she held it up to inspect her work, she saw it. There, on the rough brown wool, was a small, perfectly stitched letter J. Her breath caught in her throat. It was such an intimate, permanent gesture, an unconscious claiming. She almost picked the stitches out, but something stopped her. She folded the shirt carefully and set it aside, her heart beating a little too fast. A few days later, Jacob began a project of his own. He had dragged a large, cured log of aspen into the clearing and began to work on it with his axe and a small carving knife. For days, the sound of his chopping and whittling joined the rhythm of their lives. He worked with a quiet intensity, shaving away the wood in long, fragrant curls. Emma would sit on a nearby stump, watching him for hours, her chin resting on her mittened hands. What is it, she would ask each day? Patience, he would answer, a rare smile touching his lips. Slowly, a shape began to emerge, a seat, a high back, and two long, curved runners. He was making a rocking chair. When it was finished, he sanded it with a piece of rough stone until it was smooth as glass and set it by the fire. It was a beautiful, simple thing, a piece of furniture that spoke of comfort, of rest, of permanence. It spoke of a future. He began teaching Emma to carve. Too, he found her a small, soft piece of pine and showed her how to hold the knife. His large, calloused hand wrapped gently around her small one. "You let the wood tell you what it wants to be," he told her, his voice a low rumble, under his guidance. She whittled the wood into a lopsided, endearing bird. It was the first thing she had ever made, and she carried it with her everywhere, a small totem of this new life, a testament to the patient kindness of a man who was still a stranger. But the world outside their small clearing had not forgotten them. When their supplies ran low, Jacob knew he had to return to Redemption Springs. He left at dawn, his face set in grim lines. Sarah watched him go, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. The town was a wound, and he was walking right back into it. The moment Jacob stepped onto the main street, he felt the change. The air grew thick with a contempt that was as palpable as the cold. Men who had nodded to him before now stared straight through him. Women pulled their children closer as he passed, their face tight with disapproval. At the mercantile, Mrs. Gable served him in stony silence, slapping his goods on the counter and snatching the coins from his hand without a word. He was leaving the store when Sheriff Miller stopped him. The sheriff was a decent man, with a kind face and eyes that held a perpetual weariness. He was a man who preferred peace to justice, because it was easier. "Brennan," he said, his voice low, his gaze shifting nervously up and down the street. A word. He led Jacob into the alley beside his office. "Listen," he said, not quite meeting Jacob's eye. "You are stirring things up. People are talking. Reverend Hutchkins is preaching sermons about sin finding a foothold in the wilderness." "I am just trying to live," Jacob said, his voice hard. "I know, but it is not that simple." The sheriff sighed. "Mr. Calloway has been in my office. He has got an interest in that land up there. Says the railroad might be looking to survey a route through the foothills. He is talking about filing a claim on that whole section. says the Patterson place is abandoned property. Calloway, a man who owned half the town and was hungry for the other half. The cabin is not abandoned, Jacob said. There are people living in it. The sheriff finally looked at him, his eyes full of a helpless sort of pity. That is the problem. Do you not see, according to Calloway and the Reverend, the people living in it are living in sin? It makes it easy for them to claim the moral high ground. They are saying you have got that woman up there for improper reasons. They are whispering that a child should not be raised in such a household. He lowered his voice even more. They are talking about having the girl removed for her own good. Be careful. Brennan, Calloway is a powerful man, and he does not like to be told no. Jacob walked back to the cabin, the sheriff's words a poison in his mind. The weight of the supplies on his back felt heavier now. Each sack of flour, each side of bacon a link in a chain that was tethering him to this place, to these people. He had spent years running, avoiding any kind of tie that could be broken, that could be lost. Now, he was not just putting down roots, he was planting them in poisoned soil. He looked at the smoke curling from the cabin's chimney, a fragile signal of life in the vast, indifferent wilderness. He could not tell Sarah. He could not add the weight of this fear to the burden she already carried. He would have to carry it for her. For her part, Sarah was fighting her own silent battle. Every meal they shared, every repair Jacob made to the cabin, felt like another stone added to the wall of her debt. She had come here with nothing, and he had given her everything: shelter, warmth, food, a measure of safety she had not known was possible. But his kindness felt like a cage. She did not know how to be a partner in this life they were building. She only knew how to be a recipient of his charity. They moved around each other with a careful courtesy, a man afraid to stay and a woman afraid to owe, never speaking of the thing that was growing between them, this fragile, unnamed thing that looked so much like a family. Sarah had found a small, protected patch of earth on the south side of the cabin, where the sun hit for a few hours each day. With a sharpened stick, she had tilled the frozen ground, her hands aching with the cold. Jacob had found a half-empty sack of seeds in Patterson's old shed, forgotten and dry. She planted them, a small, desperate act of faith. She was planting a future, daring the frozen ground to believe in spring. One afternoon, a storm rolled in, not with the fury of the first blizzard, but with a slow, relentless persistence. The snow fell for 3 days, thick and heavy, sealing them inside the cabin. The world shrank to the 4 log walls, the crackling fire, and the 3 of them. The forced proximity stripped away the comfortable distances of their daily routines. They were just 2 adults and a child, trapped together in the vast, white silence. On the 3rd night, the wind died down, and an unnerving quiet fell over the world. Emma was asleep in her small bed, her carved bird clutched in her hand. Sarah sat in the new rocking chair, and Jacob sat on the floor, his back against the hearth, staring into the dying flames. "I saw the first sprouts in the garden today," Sarah said, her voice soft in the stillness, "before the snow came." Jacob nodded, but did not look at her. "That is good. I worry sometimes," she confessed, her hands tightening in her lap, "about what happens when spring comes, when the town remembers we are here." He was silent for a long moment. "I will not let them harm you," he said, his voice low and certain. The promise hung in the air, simple and absolute. It was more than he had ever said, more than he had ever offered. It was a declaration. The quiet stretched between them again, but it was a different kind of quiet now, charged with unspoken emotions. Emma stirred in her sleep, her small voice, clear as a bell in the silent room, cutting through the tension. "Mama." "I am here, sweet pea," Sarah whispered. Emma's eyes were still closed, her question coming from some deep, dreaming place. "Are we a family yet?" The question fell into the room and settled over them, profound and inescapable. Sarah's breath hitched. She looked at Jacob, whose face was a mask of unreadable emotions in the dim firelight. He slowly raised his head, and his gray eyes met hers across the small room. He did not speak. She did not speak. There were no words for what they were, no easy name for the life they had forged in this lonely cabin. But in the long, shared silence, as the fire burned low and the snow blanketed the world, the answer was there. It was in the steady beat of the hammer on the roof, in the small, embroidered initial on a mended shirt, in the smooth, curved runners of a rocking chair, and in the quiet promise to keep them safe. They were not a family by name or by law, but in the heart of that winter wilderness, in that small, warm cabin, they were, and the silence said it all. The false spring arrived with the subtlety of a thrown punch. One day the world was frozen solid, the next the sun was a warm hand on the back of the neck, and the sound of dripping water was everywhere. The snow receded from the base of the pines, leaving the ground soft and dark, and the small stream near the cabin, which had been a ribbon of ice for months, broke free and began to chatter over the stones. It was a day that felt like a promise, a day for new beginnings. Sarah had taken their laundry down to the stream, the clean, sharp scent of lye soap mingling with the damp, earthy smell of the thaw. Emma, delighted by the reappearance of mud and water, was squatting by the bank, trying to sail a leaf boat in the current. Jacob was nearby, the rhythmic thud of his axe echoing in the clearing as he split firewood. He had taken off his heavy coat and his shirt, working in just his undershirt, the muscles in his back and shoulders moving with a fluid power. He had also taken off the silver locket he always wore, hanging it carefully on the branch of a small fir tree to keep it safe from his work. It was the glint of sun on metal that caught Emma's eye. Her leaf boat had capsized, and her attention drifted. She toddled over to the tree, her small fingers reaching for the shiny object. It was the first time she had ever seen it up close. "Mama, look!" she called out, holding it up. Sarah glanced over, a smile on her face. But the smile faded as she saw what Emma held. She had always been aware of the locket, a silent, silver presence against his chest. But she had never asked about it. It was part of the history he carried, a door she had no right to open. With the innocent, fumbling curiosity of a 5-year-old, Emma fiddled with the small clasp. It was old and worn, and with a faint click, it sprang open. Emma peered inside. "There is a lady," she announced, "and some fluff." She trotted over to Jacob, who had just set his axe down to wipe the sweat from his brow. She held the open locket up to him. "Look, Jacob, a lady." The change in him was swift and terrifying. The color drained from his face, leaving the sun-weathered skin a sickly gray. He froze, his hand halfway to his forehead, his breath catching in his chest. For a long moment, he simply stared at the tiny, faded photograph of a smiling woman and the impossibly small, pale curl of a baby's hair nestled beside it. Then, with a hand that trembled violently, he took the locket from Emma. He did not say a word. He did not look at Sarah. He simply turned and walked away, his stride stiff and unnatural, following the path of the stream until he disappeared into the dense stand of pines. The sound of the axe was gone, and the sudden silence was deafening. Sarah's heart pounded against her ribs. She dried her hands on her apron and went to Emma, kneeling down. "Sweet pea, that locket is very special to Jacob. It holds a sad memory for him." Emma's lower lip began to tremble. "Did I break it?" "No, darling, you did not break it," Sarah reassured her, stroking her hair. "You just opened it. It is all right." She settled Emma with her carved bird and a pile of smooth stones, then rose and followed the path Jacob had taken. She found him 100 yards upstream. He was on his knees at the water's edge, his broad shoulders slumped, his head buried in his hands. His body was racked with the kind of sobs that make no sound, a deep, silent agony that was more terrible than any scream. The carefully constructed walls he had built around himself had crumbled, and all the grief he had carried for years had rushed in, drowning him. Sarah stopped. This was a private sorrow, a sacred space. She felt like an intruder. But to leave him alone felt like an act of cruelty. She waited, giving him a moment. Then she walked forward quietly and knelt in the damp earth beside him. She did not speak. She did not offer empty words of comfort. She simply laid her hand on the center of his back, a small, steady point of contact in his storm of pain. She could feel the tremors that ran through him, the desperate fight for control. She just kept her hand there, a silent offering of presence, a quiet promise that he was not alone. They stayed like that for a long time, until the spasms of grief began to subside and the only sound was the rushing of the stream. That evening, the mood in the cabin was heavy with unspoken things. After Emma was asleep, her quiet breathing a soft rhythm in the stillness, Jacob finally broke the silence. He sat on the floor by the hearth, turning the locket over and over in his rough hands. "I was not there," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "When the sickness came, I was miles away, digging in the dirt for rocks that shined. I told myself it was for them. So Martha would have a fine house, so Thomas would never want for anything." He looked up at Sarah, his eyes hollowed out by memory. But that was a lie. It was for me, for my pride. I came back and the town was a graveyard. The doctor told me. He told me she called my name, right at the end. He closed his eyes, his face a mask of anguish. I ran. I have been running ever since, because every time I stop, every time I close my eyes, I see their faces, and I know I failed them. Sarah listened, her heart aching for him. She knew what it was to be judged, to feel the weight of failure, but his was a burden she could scarcely imagine. She moved from the rocking chair and sat on the floor across from him. "My husband," she began, her own voice quiet. "He left a month before Emma was born. He said he was going to find work. He never came back, for a long time. I told myself that made me a failure. The women in the town, they looked at me and saw a sinner. They took my home. They tried to take my dignity. They wanted me to drown in my shame." She leaned forward, her gaze intense. "If I let that sadness, that shame, be the only story I ever tell, then they win. The past wins." She looked directly at him, her voice gaining a fierce strength. "Grief does not honor the dead. Jacob, living does. Living and finding a way to be whole again. You have to learn how to be happy. For them." Her words struck a chord deep inside him, a truth he had been running from for years. Happiness had felt like a betrayal of his grief. But hearing it from her, a woman who had faced her own kind of hell and had refused to be consumed by it, the idea began to seem possible. Later that night, as Sarah was banking the fire, she saw him move. He quietly gathered his bedroll and blanket from their usual spot on the floor near the door. He walked over to the small, enclosed lean-to he had built against the back wall of the cabin, a place for storing wood and supplies. He opened the door and placed his things inside. The space was small and rough, but it was separate. It was still under the same roof, protected by the same walls he had mended, but it was his own. It was a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement of a new boundary between them. He was no longer a guest sleeping on her floor. He was a man with his own room, in a house he was helping to build. It was a profound and subtle shift, a quiet step toward a different kind of future. While a fragile peace was being forged in the wilderness, a different kind of alliance was being cemented in Redemption Springs. In his richly appointed office above the bank, Mr. Calloway poured 2 glasses of whiskey. He handed one to the Reverend Hutchkins, whose pious face looked out of place against the backdrop of leather-bound books and maps detailing land claims. "The paperwork is being drawn up," Calloway said, his voice smooth as the aged liquor. "A formal claim on the abandoned Patterson property, and a petition to the circuit judge regarding the welfare of the child." The Reverend took a small, neat sip of the whiskey. "It is a matter of Christian duty," he said, his voice unctuous. "The child is being raised in a den of iniquity by a fallen woman and a drifter of questionable character. We must act as the girl's moral guardians. Of course, Reverend, Calloway said, a thin smile playing on his lips. He cared nothing for the child's soul. He cared about the rumor he had heard from his contacts back east, a rumor about a railroad survey that would put a track right through the valley, making the land worth 100 times its current value. Your moral authority gives our legal claim the weight it needs. We are simply two concerned citizens, working together for the good of the community. But the community was not as united as they believed. A few days later, when Jacob rode into town for salt and lamp oil, he felt the usual wall of cold disapproval, but this time, there were cracks in it. He stopped at the saloon, knowing it was the one place where a man could hear the truth. Midsum, the big barrel-chested owner, was polishing a glass behind the bar. He looked up as Jacob entered, his expression unreadable. "Brennan," he grunted. "Whiskey." Jacob nodded. Midsum poured the drink and slid it down the bar. "Heard the good Reverend is planning a crusade to save the sinners in the hills," he said, his voice a low rumble laced with sarcasm. "Seems he and Calloway have decided your souls are worth less than the dirt you are living on." "I heard something like that," Jacob said grimly. "Watch your back," Midsum warned. "Calloway owns most things in this town, including the law. But," he added, leaning closer, "he does not own all the people. Not all of us have forgotten what common decency looks like." Leaving the saloon, Jacob was walking toward the mercantile when a woman's voice called his name softly. It was the blacksmith's wife, a quiet woman he had only ever seen at a distance. She hurried over, her face etched with worry. She pressed a cloth-wrapped bundle into his hands. It was still warm. "For the little girl," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously up and down the street. "It is not much, just bread." Before he could thank her, she turned and scurried back toward the forge, disappearing inside. Jacob stood there for a moment, holding the warm loaf of bread. It was a small gesture, but it was a powerful one. It was a sign that they were not entirely alone, that there were embers of kindness still glowing in the cold ashes of the town's judgment. He got his supplies and was leading the mule out of the livery stable when 3 men blocked his path. Sheriff Miller was in the lead, his face a miserable portrait of a man doing something he hated. Flanking him were Mr. Calloway and another man, a stranger in a city suit with a leather briefcase and cold, calculating eyes. "Brennan," the sheriff mumbled, his gaze fixed on Jacob's boots. "We need a word." Calloway stepped forward, a predatory smile on his face. "There is no need for unpleasantness. Sheriff, this is a simple legal matter." He took a sheaf of papers from the man in the suit and held them out to Jacob. "This is a formal notice. Mr. Brennan, I have filed a claim on the abandoned property you are currently occupying. You have 7 days to vacate the premises." Jacob stared at the papers, his blood running cold. 7 days. "And this," Calloway continued, his voice dripping with false concern as he tapped a second document attached to the first. "This is a copy of a petition we are sending to the circuit judge. It expresses the town's grave concerns for the welfare of the child. Emma Mitchell. We feel it is our moral duty to see her removed from your unhealthy influence and placed in a proper, God-fearing home until more permanent arrangements can be made." The words hit Jacob with the force of a physical blow. It was not just about the land. It was never just about the land. They were threatening to take Emma. They were going to tear their small, fragile world apart, using the law as a weapon and a child as a pawn. He stood frozen in the dim light of the stable, the papers in his hand feeling as heavy as a death sentence, the smell of hay and manure suddenly thick with the stench of pure, calculated cruelty. He rode back with the devil on his shoulder and a death sentence in his hand. The papers, crackling with every gust of wind, felt like they were burning through his leather glove. 7 days to vacate, and a petition to steal a child's life. The words circled in his mind like vultures over a fresh kill. Unhealthy influence, moral guardians, for her own good. It was the language of tyrants dressed in piety, a righteous lie to conceal a greedy truth. The whole ride back to the cabin, He did not see the trail. He only saw Emma's face, her bright, trusting eyes, and a future where she was taken from them, swallowed by the town's cruel hypocrisy. He burst into the cabin without a word, his face a thundercloud. Sarah, who was stirring a pot over the fire, looked up, her expression of welcome dying on her lips as she saw his face. Emma was on the floor, arranging a family of pine cones near the hearth.
"Sarah,"
Jacob said, his voice a harsh rasp.
"Outside, now."
She followed him out into the clearing, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat of dread. The air was cold, but not as cold as the look in his eyes. He thrust the papers into her hand. She read them, her eyes flying across the formal, looping script, the legalistic words a cruel and foreign language. Her hand began to tremble, the papers shaking violently. She read the second document, the petition, and a small, wounded sound escaped her throat. She looked up at him, her face ashen, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored his own.
"They cannot,"
she whispered. "They would not." "They will," he said, his voice raw. "Calloway wants the land, the Reverend wants your soul, and they will use Emma to get both." He saw the fight drain out of her, replaced by a wave of pure maternal panic. Her strength, the thing he admired most about her, was dissolving before his eyes. And in that moment, his own panic, the desperate, clawing fear of losing this, of failing again, took over. He grabbed her arms, his grip harder than he intended. "Listen to me," he said, his voice urgent, frantic. "There is a way. There has to be." His mind raced, searching for a weapon, a shield, anything, and then the only solution he could grasp, a crude, desperate gambit, burst from his lips. "Marry me." The words fell into the cold air, ugly and misshapen. He saw the confusion in her eyes, then the dawning horror. He pressed on, blind to the damage he was doing. "We get married right away, a man and a wife. They cannot say we are living in sin then. They cannot take a child from a proper family. It is the only way. Sarah, it will shut them up." She stared at him, her face slowly hardening, the fear in her eyes being replaced by something cold and sharp. She pulled her arms from his grasp, her body rigid. "No." "What do you mean?" "No," he demanded, incredulous. "Did you not hear me? They are going to take her." "I heard you," she said, her voice a deadly quiet. "You want to put a ring on my finger like a brand on a cow to prove ownership. You want to use a wedding vow as a legal document to silence a hypocrite." She took a step back, her eyes blazing with a cold fire he had never seen before. "I am not a problem to be solved, Jacob. I am not a duty to be performed so you can feel like you have finally done right by someone. I will not trade my shame for your obligation." "That is not what I meant," he stammered, the force of her anger stunning him. "What did you mean?" she shot back, her voice dripping with ice. "Did you mean that you love me, that you want to build a life with me? Or did you mean you see a trap and you are willing to chew off your own leg to get out of it? And I just happen to be the most convenient tool for the job." The accusation struck him dumb. He had not thought about love. He had only thought about protecting them, about fighting back. But she had stripped his clumsy, panicked gesture down to its bare, ugly bones. It was an act of desperation, not devotion, and it had insulted her more deeply than any of the town's scorn. "I'm sorry," he finally managed, but the words were hollow. "So am I," she said, her voice brittle. She turned and walked back into the cabin, shutting the door behind her with a soft, final click that echoed in the clearing like a gunshot. He stood there, stunned, the silence of the forest pressing in on him. He had faced down armed men, killer storms, and starvation, but he had never felt so utterly defeated. He turned, and without a conscious thought, swung himself onto the mule's back and rode away, not toward the trail that led deeper into the wilderness, but back toward the poison of the town. He did not stop until he was standing in front of Midsom's saloon. He tethered the mule and pushed through the bat-wing doors. The familiar smell of stale beer, sweat, and sawdust a grim comfort. He strode to the bar and threw a coin down. Whiskey. Midsum, who had seen the look on his face, poured the shot without a word and slid it over. Jacob stared at the amber liquid, at the way the light from the grimy window caught in the glass. Here it was. The old answer. The drifter's comfort. A way to burn the edges off the pain, to blur the face of failure until it was unrecognizable. He could drink this, and then another, and by morning he could be 100 miles from here. The memory of a woman with fire in her eyes and a little girl with a carved bird, just another ghost to add to his collection. He reached for the glass, his fingers trembling slightly. As he did, he caught sight of his own reflection in the long, dark mirror behind the bar. He saw a man with wild, haunted eyes, his face a mask of desperation and failure. He saw the same man who had stood in the dirt of a graveyard all those years ago. The man who ran. "Are you planning on drinking that?" Brennan Midsum's voice was a low, gravelly rumble. "Or are you just going to stare a hole through the glass?" Jacob looked from his reflection to the whiskey and back again. He saw two paths laid out before him with terrible clarity. One was in that glass, a path that led back into the lonely, empty darkness he knew so well. The other was back up that cold trail, toward the woman he had hurt and the child he had sworn to protect. It was a path that promised nothing but a fight, and likely more pain, but it was not the path of a coward. With a deep, shuddering breath, he pushed the full glass of whiskey away from him. He turned his back on the bar, on his own reflection, and walked out of the saloon, leaving Midsum staring after him with a look of grudging respect. Back at the cabin, the silence was a living thing, a cold, heavy blanket that smothered the air after Jacob had stormed away. Sarah had stood in the middle of the room, her body numb, her mind a chaotic storm. It was over. The small, fragile life they had built here was a ruin. Calloway would take the land, the Reverend would take Emma, and Jacob was gone. A wave of utter exhaustion washed over her. She was tired of fighting. She was tired of being strong. She looked around the small cabin at all the evidence of their shared work, the smooth, sturdy rocking chair, the tightly sealed chinking between the logs, the faint, lingering scent of his wood smoke and sweat. Each object was a fresh wound, with the slow, methodical movements of the defeated. She began to pack. It was a ritual of surrender. She took their few spare clothes from the pegs on the wall and folded them into their satchel. She wrapped the tin plates and the single iron skillet in a cloth. Each item she touched felt like a white flag. She saw Emma in the corner, her face pale and confused, clutching the small, lopsided wooden bird Jacob had helped her carve. The sight of it, of that small piece of his kindness in her daughter's hand, was almost more than she could bear. She was about to take the blanket from Emma's small bed when she paused. Through the open door, she could see the small patch of garden she had so carefully tended. It was a pathetic little plot, a testament to a hope that now seemed foolish. She walked outside, needing to feel the cold air on her face. Emma followed her, her small boots making soft prints in the damp earth. She walked right past Sarah and knelt down beside the tiny, green shoots that were just beginning to push their way toward the sun. She reached out a small, gentle finger and touched a fragile new leaf. "Mama," she said, her voice small and clear in the vast silence. Her eyes were full of a simple, heartbreaking concern. "If we leave, the plants will die." The words struck Sarah with the force of a physical blow. She looked down at her daughter, a small child trying to protect a patch of green in a world determined to crush them. And in that moment, something inside Sarah shifted. A core of iron that had been bent by despair began to straighten, to glow with a dull, hot fire. What had she been about to do? Run? Again. She had run from the shame of her past, from the scorn of the town. She had been ready to run from this, too. And what lesson would that teach her daughter that dignity was found in retreat? That the only response to injustice was to pack your bags and disappear? That a home was something that could be taken from you, not something you fought for? No, not anymore. She knelt beside Emma, her own hand covering her daughter's on the small, living plant. The cold, damp earth felt solid and real beneath her knees. This was their ground. These were their roots. However shallow, they would not be torn out without a fight. "You are right, Sweet Pea," she said, her voice thick but steady. "We are not leaving. The plants will not die." She looked at her daughter, a fierce, protective love rising in her, a force more powerful than any fear. "We are staying." The night was the longest of her life. She did not pack. She did not sleep. She sat in the rocking chair, Jacob's chair, and watched the fire burn down to embers, her resolve hardening with every passing hour. The first pale light of dawn was filtering through the trees when she saw him. A figure, walking steadily up the path. It was Jacob. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. But he was not running. He was coming home. She rose and went to the door. Stepping out onto the small porch to meet him, he stopped a few feet away, the cool morning air between them thick with the wreckage of yesterday's fight. He looked at her, his gray eyes full of a deep, weary sorrow. He had come back to face the consequences, to face her. They both opened their mouths at the exact same moment. The need to bridge the chasm between them, a desperate, shared impulse. "I am sorry," he said. "I am sorry," she said. The words collided. Two small, inadequate offerings in the vast, uncertain silence. They stopped, the apologies hanging in the air. A fragile truce. The fight was over. The fear remained. And the question of what came next, of whether they would choose to fight together out of love or out of terror, was a shadow that lay between them, as vast and unknown as the wilderness itself. The cool morning air on the porch was a clean, sharp slate. The sun was just beginning to cut a brilliant orange gash across the distant mountain peaks, spilling light into their small clearing. The apologies of the dawn still hung between them, fragile but real. Jacob took a step closer, not with the frantic urgency of the day before, but with a quiet, deliberate reverence. He reached out and took Sarah's hand. His was rough and calloused. Hers was chapped from work, and the connection was immediate, a circuit of shared struggle and unspoken hope. He looked from her hand to her face, his gray eyes clear and steady, stripped of all panic and pride. "Yesterday," he began, his voice a low, even rumble, "I spoke out of fear, and I was wrong. I offered you a solution when I should have been offering you my heart." He paused, taking a breath that seemed to draw strength from the solid earth beneath them. "I have heard the story they tell in town. She was left behind with her daughter and no name, and I thought a cowboy could ride in and give her a new one, a new life, make everything right." He shook his head slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "But I am not giving you a name, Sarah, and I am not giving you a life. Yours is your own, and you have fought for it with more grit than any man I have ever known. I am asking if you would let me share it. I am asking you to take my name and let me take my place beside you and Emma, not as a shield, as a partner." He squeezed her hand gently. "I am asking you to marry me. Sarah Mitchell. Not because I am scared of them, but because I am scared of a life without you in it." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, not of fear or sorrow, but of a profound, soul-deep relief. This was not a desperate gambit. This was a true and honest declaration, offered in the clear light of day. It was the proposal of a man who was done running. She did not hesitate. "Yes," she whispered, the word, a quiet vow in the morning stillness. "Yes, Jacob." The moment of peace was beautiful, but they both knew it was fleeting. The threat was still there, a poison seeping toward them from Redemption Springs. The warmth of their new promise was immediately tempered by the cold reality of their situation. A marriage license will not stop Calloway from taking the land, Sarah said, her voice practical now, her mind already turning to the fight ahead. No, Jacob agreed, his expression hardening with a new resolve. But he is claiming it is abandoned property. It is not, and I think I know a way to prove it. He looked off in the direction of the county seat. A day's hard ride away. Old man Patterson. The winter before he passed. I found him on the trail. His wagon axle snapped in a blizzard. He would have frozen before morning. I got him and his team to shelter. Jacob's eyes focused, a memory taking shape. He told me his wife, Martha, lived in the county seat. He was always talking about her. He said he owed me more than a drink. If she is still there, maybe she can help. And what do we do? Sarah asked, her gaze turning toward the town. A fierce, protective light ignited in her eyes. She would not hide. She would not wait for a verdict to be delivered by men who had already judged her. Sunday, she said, her voice low and determined. Tomorrow is Sunday. The whole town will be at church. All our accusers, all our judges, all under one roof. Jacob understood immediately. Sarah, you do not have to do that. Yes, she said, her chin lifting. I do. I will not be the monster they hide from in the woods. I will take my daughter to the house of God, and I will sit in their pews, and I will force them to look me in the eye as they condemn me. It was a terrifying prospect. A walk directly into the heart of the hornet's nest, but it was an act of defiance, a way of seizing the narrative. They had a plan. He would fight with the law. She would fight with the truth. The next morning, the bell of the Redemption Springs Community Church tolled, its solemn, clanging notes rolling across the thawing landscape. Its call to worship sounded to Sarah like a summons to a trial. She had dressed herself and Emma in their best, which was not much. Her one good dress was faded but clean, and she had managed to press a ribbon for Emma's hair. She held her daughter's hand, a small, warm anchor in a sea of her own fear, and walked up the steps. As they pushed open the heavy doors, a hush fell over the assembled congregation. It was as if a cold wind had blown through the room. Conversation ceased. Heads turned. Every eye was on them. Sarah saw the shock, the contempt, the barely concealed satisfaction on the faces of her neighbors. She saw Mrs. Gable whisper something venomous to the woman beside her. She ignored them all, her gaze fixed on the simple wooden cross at the front of the church. With her back straight and her head held high, she led Emma to an empty pew near the back and sat down. Reverend Hutchkins ascended to the pulpit, his face a mask of pious gravity. He opened his Bible, but his eyes were on Sarah. His sermon began with a reading about the cleansing of the temple, his voice rising with theatrical fervor as he spoke of casting out corruption and sin. He did not use her name, but every word was a stone cast directly at her. He spoke of vipers nesting in our midst, and of women of loose morals who lead good men astray. He warned of the taint of sin that can corrupt even the most innocent of children, with every righteous pronouncement. Sarah could feel the self-satisfaction in the room growing, the congregation nodding in agreement, their judgment a palpable, suffocating force. Emma squirmed beside her, sensing the hostility in the air. Sarah simply put a calming arm around her and stared straight ahead, her face a pale, impassive mask. She was alone, a single, defiant figure against a tide of sanctimonious hatred. But then, just as the Reverend was reaching the crescendo of his condemnation, a voice, deep and laced with undisguised sarcasm, cut through the holy silence. "Tell me, Reverend," it boomed from the center of the church, "in all your reading, did you ever come across the part where God hired us to be his moral prison guards?" Every head whipped around. Midsome, the saloon keeper, was on his feet. He was a large, imposing man, a sinner in the eyes of everyone present, and yet he stood there in the house of God with more courage than any of them. The Reverend sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "Mr. Midsome, this is hardly the time or place." "Seems to me it is the perfect place," Midsome retorted, his voice filling the room. A place to talk about what is right, and it is not right to use this book. He pointed a thick finger at the Bible on the pulpit, as a weapon to tear a woman down and steal her child, just so a greedy man can get his hands on a piece of land. "This is a matter for the law," a voice roared from the front pew. Mr. Calloway was on his feet now, his face purple with rage. "The law will see that justice is done. The law will see that this filth is cleaned out of our community." "The law? You say?" a new voice asked from the back of the church. The main doors swung open, and Jacob Brennan stood silhouetted against the bright morning sun. He was covered in mud and sweat, his face etched with exhaustion, but he strode down the aisle with a purpose that commanded the attention of everyone in the room. He walked right up to the front, stopping before the furious Mr. Calloway. "You want to talk about the law," Calloway Jacobs said, his voice quiet but carrying a steel edge that cut through the tense silence. "Let us talk about the law." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a formal, notarized document, bearing the official seal of the Wyoming Territory. "This," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "is a quit-claim deed, signed and witnessed this morning by Martha Patterson, the legal heir to the Patterson property. In gratitude for services rendered to her late husband, she has transferred all rights and ownership of the 80 acres and the cabin upon it to me." He held the paper up for all to see. The dark, embossed seal, a mark of undeniable, official truth. "I am the legal owner of that land. Now, if you or any of your men set one foot on my property with the intent to threaten or harass my family, I will have the law on you." A collective gasp went through the congregation. Calloway stared at the document, his mouth agape, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. All eyes turned to Sheriff Miller, who stood near the door, looking deeply uncomfortable. He was a man caught between a powerful tyrant and the actual law. For a long moment, he hesitated. Then, looking at the official seal on the paper in Jacob's hand, and at the quiet, unyielding dignity of the woman in the back pew, something in him seemed to solidify. He found his courage. He walked forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Mr. Calloway," he said, his voice clear and steady for the first time in years. "The man has a legal title. The matter is closed. If I hear one more word about you harassing these people, I will arrest you myself for intimidation. That is the law." The power in the room had shifted. Suddenly and irrevocably, Calloway, speechless with rage, looked around for support, but found only uncertain, wavering eyes. The solid wall of righteous judgment had fractured. Sarah saw a few people, the blacksmith's wife among them, give her a small, hesitant nod of acknowledgement. It was not an embrace, not yet, but it was a start. It was respect. The church bell began to toll again, signaling the end of the service, but it no longer sounded like a judgment. It sounded like a new day dawning. That night, the cabin was a haven of quiet peace. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing glow on the log walls. Emma was asleep, her breathing soft and even. Jacob and Sarah sat side by side on the floor, their shoulders just touching. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clean, quiet stillness. Jacob reached over and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "You were brave today," he said, his voice a low murmur. "So were you," she whispered. He was quiet for a long moment, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "I am a flawed man. Sarah," he confessed, his gaze on the flames. "I have made a lifetime of mistakes. I ran when I should have stayed. I was silent when I should have spoken." "And I was a fool," she answered, her voice thick with emotion. "I let shame build a wall around my heart so thick I almost did not recognize love when it was standing right in front of me." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he turned, his own rough cheek resting against her hair. He smelled of trail dust, sweat, and wood smoke, the scent of her new life. They sat in the warm, fire-lit silence, their hands intertwined, their foreheads touching. Two broken people who had found a way to be whole in each other. They spoke in whispers of past sorrows and future dreams, of forgiveness and of a hope that had been born in the heart of a merciless winter.
We should get married,
Sarah whispered against his temple. He smiled, a true, deep smile that reached his eyes. I agree. He paused, a hint of wry humor in his voice. But I do not think I want to ask Reverend Hutchkins to do the honors. She laughed, a soft, genuine sound of pure happiness. No, she said. I think we can find a better way. Their decision to marry, made in the quiet aftermath of battle, was not a secret to be kept but a foundation to be laid. And it needed to be built on solid ground. Jacob rode into town not with the defiance of their last visit, but with a quiet purpose. He went to the one place he knew he could find a measure of unvarnished truth, Midsum's saloon. The big man was wiping down the bar, the midday light catching the dust motes dancing in the air. Midsum, Jacob said, his voice low. I need a preacher. Midsum paused his wiping, a slow, wry smile spreading across his face. Finally decided to make an honest man of yourself. Brennan, I would have thought the good Reverend Hutchkins would be thrilled to save a soul. I am not looking for that kind of salvation, Jacob said. I am looking for a man of God, not a man of judgment, someone who knows the difference. Midsum's smile faded, replaced by a thoughtful expression. He set his rag down and leaned on the bar. There is a man, Brother Elias. He is not tied to any church. He has been riding a circuit through these territories for 30 years, burying the dead, marrying the living, and asking nothing but a hot meal and a place for his horse in return. He travels with the word of God in his saddlebag and the grace of God in his heart. He was heading north. If you ride hard, you might catch him before he crosses the Sweetwater. Jacob did ride hard. He found Brother Elias 2 days later, a man as weathered and resilient as the landscape he traveled, his beard a river of white against his sun-darkened skin, and his eyes holding the patient kindness of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and still chose to believe in the best of it. He listened to Jacob's story without interruption, his gaze never wavering. When Jacob was finished, the old preacher simply nodded. A home is not the roof over your head, Brother Elias said, his voice a gentle rasp. It is the foundation you build in each other's hearts. I will be there. While Jacob was gone, Sarah found herself in an unexpected alliance. She had gone to the blacksmith's forge to have a pot mended, and the blacksmith's wife, Mary, had invited her in for coffee. They sat in the small, warm kitchen, the scent of coal dust and baking bread in the air. Mary was a woman of few words, but her actions spoke volumes. She had been the first to show them kindness, and now she offered her friendship. As they talked, a quiet understanding grew between them. On the day of the wedding, Mary arrived at the cabin with a small bundle. Inside was a bolt of pale blue calico fabric. Every bride needs a new dress, she said simply, refusing any thanks. Sarah spent the next 2 days sewing, her needle flying, the simple dress a manifestation of a hope she had not allowed herself to feel for a very long time. Jacob returned with Brother Elias in tow the day before the wedding. He carried with him not just the promise of a ceremony, but a piece of scrap iron he had bought from a freighter. He went to the blacksmith's forge, and with a nod of permission from the smithy, he fired up the bellows. All afternoon, the ring of his hammer on steel echoed through the small valley. He was not a blacksmith, and his work was not perfect. He beat and shaped the hot metal, his sweat hissing as it dripped onto the forge. His entire focus poured into this single, small object. He was forging not just a ring, but a promise, hammering all his past failures, all his regret, all his fierce, protective love into a simple, unbroken circle. When he was finished, he plunged it into a bucket of water. The ring that emerged was not smooth or polished. It was dark and slightly uneven, bearing the marks of the hammer, a testament to the hard work that had created it. But when he slid it onto his own finger, it felt solid, it felt true, and it was warm from the fire. They were married on the porch of the cabin they had rebuilt together. The late afternoon sun slanted through the pines, turning the air to gold. Sarah wore her new blue dress, and Jacob had put on the shirt she had mended. The small, embroidered letter, J, a secret testament, over his heart. Brother Elias stood before them, his Bible held in his gnarled hands, the pages worn thin with use. Their only guests were Mary the blacksmith's wife and Midsum, who looked profoundly out of place and yet completely at home, his massive frame filling the small porch. Brother Elias did not deliver a long sermon. He did not speak of sin or damnation. He spoke of the simple, difficult work of love. He looked at Jacob, then at Sarah, his kind eyes searching theirs. "The world makes promises it does not keep," he said, his voice quiet but resonant. "Riches fade, beauty withers, and hard times come to every door. The only vow that matters is the one you make in the stillness of your own hearts, a vow that is remade every morning you wake. So I will not ask you if you take this person for all time. I will ask you this. Do you choose each other, this day, and every day to come?" Jacob looked at Sarah, at the woman who had faced down a town's scorn and his own foolish pride, the woman who had planted a garden in frozen earth, and his heart was so full he could barely speak. "I do," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah looked at Jacob, at the man who had offered a stranger's kindness and stayed to build a home, the man who had faced his own ghosts and chosen to stand with her. And she felt a sense of peace so profound it was like coming home after a long and brutal journey. "I do," she whispered. Jacob took the rough, dark ring from his pocket. It was still warm. He slid it onto her finger. It was not a perfect fit, but it was solid. It was real. "By the grace of God and the choice you have made here today," Brother Elias said, a beatific smile spreading across his face, "I now pronounce you Jacob and Sarah Brennan. You may kiss your bride." As he leaned in and gently kissed her, Sarah heard her new name for the first time, Sarah Brennan. It did not feel like a brand or a title. It felt like her own name, spoken correctly at last. It was a name she had not been given, but one she had chosen, a name forged in fire and faith, a name that meant home. A genuine, unburdened smile spread across her face. At that exact moment, Emma, who had been watching the proceedings with wide, solemn eyes, seemed to finally understand. With a whoop of pure joy, she tossed a handful of wildflowers she had been clutching into the air, the bright petals scattering around them like confetti. "Papa," she shrieked and launched herself at Jacob's legs, hugging him with all her might. The wedding feast was a sacrament of their own making. They sat around the rough-hewn table, sharing a simple meal of rabbit stew, thick with the carrots and potatoes that had grown from the seeds of faith Sarah had planted in her small, defiant garden. It was a holy communion, a celebration of a harvest they had fought for and won. Later, as twilight settled over the valley, they all sat on the porch. The rocking chair Jacob had built creaked with a soft, companionable rhythm. The smoke from their chimney rose straight and true into the still, evening air, a sign of a calm and settled hearth. A V formation of wild geese flew overhead, their calls a wild, free song against the deepening purple of the sky, heading south for the winter. Life went on. The seasons turned, and they were here, together. Emma, tired from the day's excitement, was a sleepy weight in Sarah's lap. Jacob, in a moment of fatherly ambition, had decided that the ribbon in Emma's hair needed retying. He fumbled with the piece of silk, his large, capable hands, which could split a log with a single blow or soothe a frightened child, rendered utterly useless by the simple mechanics of a bow. His brow furrowed in concentration, his tongue stuck out from the corner of his mouth. Sarah watched him, a wave of warm, gentle amusement washing over her. "It would seem," she said, her voice laced with a soft tease, "that I have married the one cowboy in all of Wyoming who can be defeated by a ribbon." Jacob looked up, a sheepish grin spreading across his face. "It seems you have," he admitted, surrendering the ribbon to her far more capable hands. A week later, they needed supplies. The journey to Redemption Springs was different this time. They walked down the main street not as outcasts, but as a family. There was no welcoming committee. No one rushed out to shake their hands or offer apologies. The town's acceptance was not a warm embrace, but a slow, grudging thaw. The open hostility was gone, replaced by a kind of awkward, uncertain respect. A few men who had once stared through Jacob now gave him a curt, almost imperceptible nod. The blacksmith, seeing them approach, came out of his forge and clapped Jacob on the shoulder, a silent, powerful gesture of solidarity. Several women, who had previously gathered their skirts to avoid brushing against Sarah, now met her gaze, a flicker of something new in their eyes. Not friendship, perhaps, but a dawning recognition of her strength. It was not forgiveness. It was not a grand reconciliation, but it was enough. It was a start. It was the quiet, hopeful beginning of a hard-won peace. The passage of seasons is the truest measure of a life. The bitter winter that had forged their family gave way to a muddy, hopeful spring. The spring, in turn, yielded to a long, warm summer that baked the earth and turned the high meadows a deep, rich green. The small, defiant sprouts in Sarah's garden grew into strong, vibrant plants under the steady sun, a testament to her faith and a promise of the harvest to come. With the turning of the seasons, the town of Redemption Springs began its own slow, almost imperceptible thaw. The change was not announced with trumpets or grand apologies. It was felt in the small, quiet moments of ordinary life. When Jacob and Sarah rode into town for supplies in late summer, the mules' saddlebags ready for the bounty of their first real harvest, the air on the main street was different. The stares were gone, replaced by a kind of reserved curiosity. The silence that had once greeted them was now filled with the normal, mundane sounds of a town at work, sounds that no longer seemed to halt at their approach. Mr. Calloway still walked the boardwalks, but his stride had lost its proprietary swagger. The rumors Jacob had heard from a freighter proved true. Calloway's aggressive land grab had attracted the attention of the territorial government and the railroad barons back east, men with far more power and influence than he possessed. His plans were now subject to scrutiny, his dealings no longer a private kingdom but a matter of official record. He had overplayed his hand, and in doing so had lost the absolute authority he once wielded. He would nod curtly at Jacob now, the greeting of one landowner to another, a bitter but necessary acknowledgment of his defeat. He was a man diminished, his ambition checked not by morality, but by the inconvenient arrival of a law bigger than his own. The influence of the Reverend Hutchkins had waned even more noticeably. His sermons, once the unassailable moral compass of the community, now seemed to ring hollow in the ears of his congregation. The public defeat of his crusade against the Brennans had exposed the ugly greed beneath his piety. People had been forced to look at the targets of his condemnation, to see not abstract sin, but a woman of quiet courage, a man of surprising integrity, and a happy, thriving child. They had been forced to look at themselves, and many had not liked what they saw. His pews were still occupied, but the fear was gone, replaced by a thoughtful silence. The town, having been led to the brink of a great cruelty, had taken a step back. They were learning, slowly and painfully, the difficult lesson of compassion. Sheriff Miller now greeted them with a genuine, weary smile. He would stop them to ask about the cabin, about their crops. His questions, a quiet apology for his past weakness and an affirmation of their rightful place in the world. He treated Jacob with a newfound respect, the respect due to a man who had not only stood his ground but had reminded the sheriff of his own duty. As they loaded their supplies, the blacksmith's wife, Mary, came out to give Emma a small sugar cookie, her smile open and warm, no longer a secret act of kindness but a public declaration of friendship. Others followed her lead in their own small ways. A nod here, a quiet, "Oh, good day, Mrs. Brennan" there. It was not a celebration, but it was an acceptance, a hard-won peace that was more valuable than any sudden conversion. They had not been forgiven, for they had done nothing wrong. They had simply endured, and in their endurance, they had held up a mirror to the town. forcing it to see its own reflection. They returned to the cabin as the sun began its long, slow descent, painting the sky in strokes of gold and rose. The valley was bathed in a warm, honeyed light. The air was still and peaceful, filled with the gentle hum of late summer insects and the rich, earthy scent of pine and ripening wild berries. Their home, which had once been a desperate, sagging shelter, was now a solid, welcoming presence in the clearing. The roof was straight and true, the windows were properly glazed, and a stack of neatly split firewood stood ready for the coming autumn. Smoke curled from the chimney, a steady, pale gray plume rising straight into the vast, silent sky, a testament to the life within. After their simple supper, they sat together on the porch, a ritual that had become the anchor of their days. Sarah was in the rocking chair, its gentle, rhythmic creak a soft percussion in the evening quiet. Emma, tired from the long day, had fallen asleep in her mother's lap, her small head nestled against Sarah's chest, her breathing a soft, even whisper. Her carved bird lay beside her, a faithful companion. The world, for her, was a place of absolute safety, a reality her parents had fought a war to create. Jacob sat on the top step, his back resting against the post beside Sarah's chair. He reached out and draped his arm around her, his hand resting on her shoulder. It was a comfortable, familiar gesture, an unspoken conversation. He looked out at the distant mountains, their peaks a dark, jagged line against the fading, golden light. He saw the neat rows of their garden, heavy with produce, the chickens pecking contentedly in the dust, the solid log walls of the home he had built. He looked at the woman beside him, her face serene in the twilight, and the child sleeping in her arms. A profound sense of peace settled over him, a quiet, powerful stillness that filled the hollow places inside him, the spaces that had been carved out by guilt and grief and a lifetime of running. He was no longer a drifter. He was a husband, a father. He was a man who had a home. He leaned his head back, his voice a low, thoughtful murmur that was almost part of the evening itself. "Everything finds its way home," he said softly, "when it has a home to find." Sarah looked down at the sleeping child in her lap, then at the strong, steady hand resting on her shoulder. She thought of the cold, desperate woman who had stood on a frozen boardwalk, clutching 4 useless coins, and the vast, terrifying distance she had traveled to get to this porch, to this moment of perfect, unassailable peace. A slow, gentle smile touched her lips. "We made one," she answered, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable certainty. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the first stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the sky. Jacob leaned in close, his lips brushing against Emma's hair, his words a soft whisper meant only for her, a promise sealed in the heart of their new life, a vow spoken to the future. Sarah leaned in too, her voice joining his, their words weaving together into a single, unbreakable bond. Forever. They stayed like that as the darkness gathered, a family framed in the golden light of a dying day, a small, stubborn point of warmth and love in the vast Wyoming wilderness. The harvest would begin tomorrow. The rumors of a coming railroad depot down the valley would bring new opportunities and new challenges to face. Together. But for now, in the stillness of that perfect evening, they were simply home. The spring had come to stay. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from to connect with each other. And remember to subscribe to Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help share this story with more people.